again. We finished last time on the note of taking individual responsibility for our thoughts and actions, which still allows us the opportunity to engage in collective action, but on a voluntary, not coercive basis. I must highly recommend the work of Will Keat on the topic of individualism relative to collectivism. Links to some of his work on this will be in the comments section. His explanations are superbly nuanced, and his mastery of the topic is on display in his recent interview with renowned Scottish commentator Neil Oliver, whose outstanding work also warrants subscription and close following. I have recently visited this topic, so I will just touch upon it and draw attention to the consequences various groups in society may anticipate, depending on which of the two philosophies they elect to follow. Virtually everyone will fall into one or other of these groups and hopefully will be able to discern what changes need to be made in their thinking if they have any desire to enjoy more freedom for themselves and especially their descendants. I can hardly expect to be able to improve on the way Will Keat has dealt with this. That's known as gilding the lily, so I'm not going to quote him extensively. Please make sure you access his work yourselves to get the full benefit of his understanding of this vital topic. I'll instead begin with a quote from Mark Passio, which you can find in full on the link shown in the comments box. Quote, "Real change will never occur as a result of people voting, petitioning, campaigning, or in any other way playing politics. Instead, real change will occur only when the people dare to actually disobey, when people stop begging the politicians' legislative permission to be free and start thinking and acting like free people, even when the ruling class has declared freedom to be illegal," end quote. Quote again, "Authority is always in the eye of the beholder. When the people stop imagining that a group of parasitical liars and thieves has a right to rule them, only then will the people have any chance of ridding themselves of authoritarian oppression, not through begging and petitioning, but only through outright disobedience and resistance," end quote. Of course, the average person's response to such statements is to feebly bemoan that they're only one person and what can they do? "If I stick my head above the parapet, I'll simply be picked off and I and my family will suffer." It's a cry heard all too frequently. Yes, if we unilaterally just disobey legislation, that is a real risk, but it's just an excuse. As I've pointed out many times, we can comply under duress, but only after calling out the immorality and injustice of the current regime. That doesn't cost anything of note financially, but it does require facing up to reality, which in turn requires honesty and having the courage to actually say to those oppressing us that what they're doing is totally wrong, immoral, and unlawful, and that they will eventually have to answer for their crimes. A frequent response is, what's the point if the oppressors are simply going to continue on their path? Well, there is a point, and it's realized when we comprehend these words of Dresden James, quote, "The ideal tyranny is that which is administered by its victims. The most perfect slaves are, therefore, those which blissfully and unawarely enslave themselves," end quote. By not confronting the principles of morality which are inextricably bound in natural law, and instead pretending that the concept of some people exercising unlawful power over others is legitimate, because it's just too hard to do anything about it, people lie to themselves about reality, and having convinced themselves over time that this lie is really a representation of the truth, blindly enslave themselves and their families in exactly the manner just described. The vast majority have always done this, which is why tyrannies have always existed. But it doesn't have to be so. We live now in an age where lip service is at least paid to the concept of individual liberty. That concept was committed to document form in 1215 with the sealing of Magna Carta. so it also exists in physical form, not just as an abstract idea. Every person can now use that as justification for lawfully dissenting from tyrannical demands. If, while the numbers are few who are aware of these facts, those few honour their moral obligation and stand and speak the truth, not their truth, the truth, others will eventually be encouraged to do likewise. Compliance under duress may be necessary initially to avoid disastrous individual harm from unlawful oppression, but once the numbers reach a critical level, society as a whole has the opportunity to say no more. Thus, each individual has a responsibility to recognise objective morality and stand in support of it, and when enough people do that, it becomes a voluntary collective action, supporting or supplying freedom for all, not just a select few. The corollary to that principle is that we do not have the right to just pretend that this obligation doesn't exist, nor to refuse to stand for morality and justice. To abdicate this responsibility is to actively support the continuance of evil oppression and slavery, based on the eternal principle that silence implies consent. We do not have that right objectively. We can see that almost everyone in modern society fits into this group of deniers and abdicators, and it's each individual's responsibility to remove themselves from it. And not by petitioning, campaigning, or playing politics, but by active, positive disobedience to false claims of authority. That is not saying that we should draw a line in the sand and sacrifice our lives in a hail of gunfire or the legal confiscation of our homes and property over a traffic fine or some such event. But we must protest it, place the perpetrators on notice of their crimes, and compile a record of each occasion. Later, when enough individuals have done this, and we have established a proper trial by jury system, these miscreants and tyrants can be brought to justice. Speaking of these perpetrators, let's define who they are and what consequences they may eventually face. They fall into three basic groups, which are politicians and legislators, including the monarch, who is supposed to be a regulator of the other two, public servants and the judiciary, including lawyers, the administrators of the outfit of the first group, and the enforcers, police and military. Let's not mince words. By participating in and enforcing a system of governance based on the initiation of force against non-aggressive fellow individuals, these groups commit morally reprehensible and in many cases obscene acts of violence and depredation. Virtually every act of legislation passed by parliaments violates constitutional law on some level, while the monarch, who is charged with policing these activities, has abdicated their responsibility virtually as completely as had they actually vacated the throne. At the moment, because of the invocation of Article 61 of Magna Carta in 2001, there is no lawful monarch, but the distinction is almost academic. Even were Charles Windsor to legitimately occupy his post, the most charitable description of his performance would be to say that at least he always shows up for the free beer and sandwiches. The monarch's role is a vital one, constitutionally, but Charles has managed to redefine it from being that of the most senior public servant to reclassification as freeloader-in-chief. As to the politicians and judiciary, I doubt that any words I could utter would reduce the contempt in which most of the population hold these parasites. The most disappointing thing about the whole picture is that so many millions still deem it an action worth taking of voting for any of these treasonous charlatans. It just illustrates how much ground we have to cover as a society to even start hoping that one day we might have freedom. These first two groups have long ceased to perform any useful functions, if indeed they ever did. It's difficult to think of any monarch worthy of the title since Alfred the Great, who died in 899. while the parliamentarians, allied with their pals the judiciary, have only ever sought their own enrichment at the hands of the masses since parliaments were instituted. The best outlook these two groups could anticipate once enough people become fully aware of their shameful criminality is to avoid life in prison with full asset stripping or the death penalty for treason. Yes, that's always been the lawful penalty for seeking the destruction of the nation. Parliament is unable to lawfully amend the Constitution to change that. So that brings us to the third group, the enforcers, particularly the police. I've already covered how these benighted souls occupy the lowest rung on the moral classifications of humanity, equivalent to the house slaves of pre-abolitionist days or the capos of World War II concentration camp fame. However, let's take another closer look at what might or possibly will befall these depraved specimens of humanity. Mark Passio once moved amongst those who issue their orders to what now passes for a constabulary. If anyone listening or viewing this is a police officer or knows one or more people who are, it behooves you to draw attention to these thoughts. The commanders of the police, their political masters, always referred to them in their private discussions as our dogs. If you're a police officer, how does that make you feel? You're classified as a beast of subhuman qualities, easily trained and manipulated to attack on command whomever your corporate paymasters order you to attack. Not only that, but you cravenly protect the worst sorts of criminals our society can produce, namely paedophiles and people in authority who you know are committing all manner of evil against those who did once bestow their trust upon you to protect them from crime. And you do it for pay. Can one sink any lower than that as a human being? Many of you are now aware of the contempt in which the average Crown subject now holds you, are you not? Isn't the issue of officer safety moving ever higher in the priorities of your administrations? Unless there is a wholesale turnaround in the attitudes and behaviour of police officers, is it not entirely possible that many of them will not even make it to trial? And that is not to be interpreted as a threat from the general public, although there is of course a possibility, a la the Ceausescus and others. Have a look at this clip of what possibly awaits corrupt police at the hands of their employers once they've decided that their usefulness as attack dogs is exhausted.
Pilots directed almost 3,000 precision strikes last year. We're super proud of it. It allows you to separate the bad guys from the good. It's a big deal. But we have something much bigger. Your kids probably have one of these, right? Not quite. Hell of a pilot? No. That skill is all AI. It's flying itself. Its processor can react 100 times faster than a human. The stochastic motion is an anti-sniper feature. Just like any mobile device these days, it has cameras and sensors, and just like your phones and social media apps, it does facial recognition. Inside here is 3 grams of shaped explosive. This is how it works. Did you see that? That little bang is enough to penetrate the skull and destroy the contents. They used to...
As mentioned in video number 2, a police officer who decides to bastardize their oath and behave unlawfully needs to be able to look over both shoulders. The chilling part of that video, the full version of which can be viewed from the link in the comments box, is near the end, where it's pointed out that such responses to perceived oppression or resistance would be extremely difficult to pinpoint, given the relative low cost and ease of procurement via hacking, etc. The Roman emperors had a Praetorian Guard, the last line of defence against assassination attempts, but they never really resolved the question of who will guard the guards. Doubtless, many of the enforcers of the current tyranny may feel as entitled as the Praetorians in their position. Such officers should be mindful of the fact that psychopaths who think nothing of orchestrating the deaths of millions for personal gain may well think even less of tying up loose ends like a bunch of attack dogs, especially if those dogs are armed. There's no evading reality, people, and that includes the inexorable functions of natural law. Why do we suppose that there has never been established a worldwide dictatorship? There will always be that spark of the love, indeed the necessity of freedom in the human spirit. Get on board. The law, not legislation, is the strength. Please include any thoughts you may have yourselves in the comments, and thank you for watching.